In this video we want to talk about corporate governance and introduce the concept and the ideas behind corporate governance. You'll see from the bottom right hand corner there are just 9 slides in this video, so it's a very brief talk. It's designed to simply introduce the concept of corporate governance and try to get some basic understanding of what's meant by the term and why it's important. The outcome of a good corporate governance practice is an accountable board of directors who ensures that the investors' interests are not jeopardized. You see, in business there are really 2 sets of individuals that we need to focus in on in the context of corporate governance. And in business these are the shareholders, who are the owners of the business. The shareholders own the business. And the management. The management, generally speaking, do not have shares in the business. Some may have, but generally speaking it's not a requirement. But the management have expert knowledge of the market. They have expert knowledge of the product, of the technology, and of the processes of the business. And if it's a large organization, there may be many shareholders. So the shareholders may be not in regular contact. It may be difficult to organize meetings of shareholders, get them all together. So the shareholders are quite separated out, whereas the management are much more cohesive. They may have regular meetings. So the management will tend to have more power than the shareholders. And this means that the management may be able to acquire resources for itself that were not intended by the shareholders. The shareholders, when they invested in the business, they invested to have security of investment and to get a high return on their investment. But the management, by virtue of their power, may be able to give themselves bonuses or have perks, have expensive company cars and foreign holidays and palatial offices. So the management may be able to sap some of the resources for themselves. These are resources that should have gone to the owners of the business. So there's a conflict between the management on the one hand and the owners of the business on the other. And the owners are the principals, in a sense. They are the owners, and the managers are the agents of the principals. They run the business. But there's a conflict between the 2 of them. And this is summarized in what's known as the principal-agent problem, and will be the subject matter of separate videos later. So I don't want to get into that here in any great detail. But one mechanism to overcome this is to have a board of directors appointed by the shareholders, perhaps, who will try to bring about fair play and stop the abuse, if there is any, on the part of the management. It'll also perhaps regulate the expectations of the shareholders. So the board of directors could be a way of bridging the gap between the management on the one hand and the shareholders on the other. Whether it's effective or not is debatable, and it may be based on a case-by-case analysis. But the investors have an issue of trying to get a fair return on their investment and not see their investment in a sense being used up in the manner I've described earlier, in the context of bonuses, excessive bonuses sometimes for senior management, and all sorts of perks. Governments have become interested in this because they're interested because they want to see businesses as efficient and effective. And therefore they are interested in ensuring that the business operates in a way which is transparent and honest and open. In fact, there have been many high profile business failures that have brought this into the limelight. Enron, for example, in America was one case in point. But there have been many high-profile business failures which suggest that there was something inherently wrong within the business, and perhaps a more thorough scrutiny of the financial matters of the business and the financial position of the business could have brought about a different outcome rather than company failure. We know, for example, during the banking crisis that the banks had been paying quite significant bonuses to senior management. Some of the banks had to be bailed out with taxpayers' money. But when the recovery started to set in subsequently, they went back to paying significant bonuses to their senior management as well. So there is an issue of trying to control large corporations and ensure proper scrutiny of the accounts and openness and transparency in the accounts to enable effective intervention and effective control of larger organizations. And this is all the province of corporate governance. This is what we are considering here. The accountability and transparency component of corporate governance would help companies gain shareholders and investors' trust. It's important that companies have the shareholders' trust because it's the shareholders who invest in the business. So it's important that the shareholders trust the business so that they will meet any call for resources that the business may wish to make. But if the shareholders feel that they're not getting their entitlement because the resources are being used up by management, then the shareholders may be reticent in lending to the business. And that would make the business perhaps vulnerable in the long run. The stakeholders, the shareholders are a big component of the stakeholders, but there are many stakeholders in organizations. That's also the subject matter of separate videos. But the stakeholders need assurance that the company will be run both honestly and commercially. Honestly in the sense that the accounts are open and transparent. There is no intention to bury information or conceal information about bonuses or about conditions of employment or contracts, and that the businesses are being run properly and commercially. And this is the province of corporate governance that focuses in on the accounts, on financial issues, and tries to make sure that the business is honest and decent and open about its dealings with others. Note here that we're discussing corporate governance. If we were discussing other issues, perhaps how the company deals with the local community, we might be talking about corporate social responsibility. But here we're dealing with the accounts, and we're dealing with the relationship between, generally speaking, the management on the one hand and the shareholders on the other. So it's corporate governance. It's different from corporate social responsibility, which deals with many other aspects and with the wider stakeholder community. Corporate governance improves stakeholders' confidence, and this would aid the sustainability of the business in the long run. Sometimes companies have to call for additional resources They have to go back to the shareholders and ask for further investment. Well, the shareholders may be reticent to make that investment if they feel they were not getting the return that they were entitled to, because the management were acquiring the resources for themselves. They were taking the resources for themselves in the form of bonuses and perks. So it's important that the business is run openly and honestly so that the shareholders have confidence to invest and make further investments in the business if need be. And that's why corporate governance is so important. Now, corporate governance theories cannot fully explain the intricacy and heterogeneity of corporate business. Corporate governance is simply trying to deal with this issue of honesty in the accounts, openness in the accounts, and that the accounts are accurate and thorough and represent a true picture of the business. And the intentions of the management should be obvious from scrutiny of the accounts. If accounts are opened in other areas, research and development areas, or perhaps asset acquisition, or they're looking at takeover bids or whatever, this should be obvious from the accounts and from scrutiny of the accounts. That information should not be concealed. After all, the shareholders own the business. So it's the function of corporate governance to try to ensure that there is this type of openness. Governance may differ from country to country due to their various cultural values, their political and social and historical circumstances. In this sense, governance is developed governance in developed and developing countries may vary due to cultural and economic contexts of individual countries. So the idea of corporate governance is not universal. It doesn't cut across all countries. But generally speaking, there is a much wider acceptance of the need for corporate governance. It was probably started in the UK with the Cadbury report. Adrian Cadbury conducted a report into corporate governance, and we won't go through facts about this or talk about it in detail. It's the subject matter again of a separate video. The Americans followed up with a piece of legislation somewhat based on the Cadbury findings, but since then many countries have enacted legislation and brought in rules and regulations governing corporate standards and corporate codes of conduct in terms of financial management. Countries like Italy has got some. Iran, even during the Islamic Revolution, introduced quite stringent corporate governance regulations. So many countries have introduced it, Australia and so on. They may take their own particular perspective, but essentially it comes down to trying to ensure that the accounts of the business represent a true, an honest and fair picture of the performance of the business, and that resources, money, is not being concealed or misused or misplaced by the management. However, even with strict regulations, there have been breaches in corporate governance, and hence its importance. It's important that it should be constantly on the agenda and constantly monitored. People are very innovative in the way they deal with each other and the way they deal with situations. And as a consequence of this, it's important that the regulations are monitored, updated, scrutinised and checked on a continuous basis. And there should be good reporting. The professional institutes of accountancy do a lot to promote good governance. Governments try to promote it. But there have been lapses. And we know that, for example, with the Maxwell case, when that opened up, there was a situation where there's been a lot of investment in quite risky projects that were being financed by pension fund resources. Now, it wasn't the intention of the people who put their money into the Maxwell funds to secure their pensions that money should have been used for risky commercial purposes. And that's what brought down that particular edifice. But corporate governance is important because it looks at the financial dealings of the business and tries to get a full, accurate, open and honest view of the dealings of the business. And that's important for the owners of the business, the shareholders. It's important for investors in the business. And that's why corporate governance is so important. As I said, it's the subject matter of many videos to come. We will deal with this in a lot more detail in other areas. But that's all we're going to deal with in this particular talk, is just to introduce the concept of corporate governance and what it is and what it's attempting to do. So let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.